Greetings and salutations, future Brazilian diplomats. My name is Carlos Eduardo Baena, and I will be your teacher for this new course. Uh, which primarily focuses on uh, objective questions from the first phase of the CACD examination. And we will be doing some exercises which already were present in some past exams, and also some new original exercises compiled by me, which are based on the exam itself and on the way that they formulate questions as well. And I can know that for some of you, the English exam might be one of the most daunting undertakings that you will have to do in order to be approved and become a new diplomat. But it's not as impossible as it may seem. I know that the level that they require of each candidate is very, very high. I can think of no other exam for the public sector here in Brazil which has a harder English requirement from the candidates. And that is why I always like to start my classes by demystifying some parts of the exam. Like, for instance, you can always, now we know for sure that CESP, the institution that organizes the exam, is not the one responsible for actually formulating the questions and creating the questions. The questions are all formulated by the Instituto Rio Branco themselves. All of the teachers who teach the newly appointed diplomats, some teachers from the linguistics department at Universidade de Brasília, and also some other known scholars in the area who are very famous in Brasilia also prepare this exam. So it's not your typical CESP examining board who will be preparing these questions. So it's very difficult to study this exam by going to other concursos, other exams, like for instance for other CESP examinations for other jobs or other vacancies, which do not have the same level of English as this course is. This course is not just a grammar English course, the ones that you might be used to in language courses around the country. This course not only tests your grammar, but also tests your background culture. It tests your analytical skills very, very thoroughly. And also, yeah, in your cultural baggage, as your background as well, and your capacity to discern what information is important and what information is not important in a text. So here you're going to find a very high, as you all know, since you're in this exercise course, you might be already schooled in the exam a lot, so some of you might already know this, but most of the texts that they choose for this exam are academic in origin, and they are very high-level academic articles sometimes. Now more so, in the past few years, they shied away a little bit from simple news articles from the New York Times or from The Guardian, other publications like that, and are now more focused on actual academic articles, and also even some literature, some English literature, as the 2015 exam showed us, with the infamous question on, actually there were 3 or 4 questions on Virginia Woolf's book Orlando, which has a very dense vocabulary and a way of speaking writing, and also which is very, very difficult for a person who's not even advanced in English, but a person who's not had experience living in a culture where English is a predominant language. So you also have to have also that cultural background when you do these questions as well, which it makes it that much more difficult. So it goes beyond those levels, those standards of English that you have, like starting from A1 through C2. Of course, the grammar knowledge that you need just and able to understand the questions is, I think, from a C1 above. If you are not at that level yet, this exam might be very, very hard to even comprehend, to even start doing the questions. So that's why, in tandem with the exercise classes, you also need to be constantly stimulated and constantly research, read, and listen to English, but not just any English, proper academic English. And also very in academic English, I'm meaning in basically two areas, in linguistics and also in international relations. And now more specifically, and also, of course, it seems rightfully so, that there are now more questions which are actually based on the diplomatic discourse, the language that diplomats use itself, and also in they almost now quoting diplomatic handbooks and also other diplomatic discourse, which you will effectively use in your career in the 30 plus years that you will have as a diplomat. So that in that area, I think they've been rightfully so gearing towards that area because, well, as a diplomat, you're going to have to use this sort of language, and you're going to have to be able to express yourself in that sort of language, and you're going to have to be able to understand texts in those languages, and also make summaries, identify relevant information in order to transmit to your superiors in that sort of language. So you have to have all of that know-how and vocabulary, especially, and all that technical jargon down, really, really down. So they're starting to test the candidates in that sort of field now in these last 2-3 years, which wasn't the case before. But now I see a lot of text which they take directly from the Oxford Dictionary handbook on diplomacy, which is something interesting, which is something that we have to prepare for as well. And this is what I intend to do in this course. All right. And in this first exercise list, which I'm going to share with you guys now, here, there we go. I primarily based the exercises on two areas which the exam seems to be focusing now. Which one was diplomatic speech, diplomatic discourse, and how diplomats act in their day-to-day lives, and in their professions, in their professional lives, actually. And also, I chose some more academic texts which are more linguistics based. If you look at the members of the examination board of the CACD, you always have one or two professors, linguistic professors, usually from UNB in Brasilia, right? And they sometimes choose texts like this one that you guys did here for the first exercise, which was present in this year's examination, which was a text discussing how language, mainly how English and American English and British English evolved and the relationship between both of these dialects and how they evolved and how they influenced each other. Uh, this text is somewhat hard because it does have a fairly specific vocabulary to the linguistics field, and it might confound some candidates who are not very used to these kind of of texts, because usually even when you're taking advanced examinations like the TOEFL, the IELTS, right, they do not have, well, for the most part, they do not have texts that go in depth into these fields, such as linguistics or international relations. They do not require you such a sophisticated vocabulary for these exams. However, for the CACD, you need to always be testing your vocabulary in these areas. And to make it even harder, it's not just linguistics. They have academic texts in history. They have academic texts sometimes in art history, and also in international relations theory and economics and all of the areas. Of course, these areas, you do kind of go over them in some other subjects for the examination, which also made me come to the conclusion that this exam is not only an English exam, it's also almost a job interview. They're testing your background, and they want to know how, not only if your English is advanced enough, but if you're if you're dealt with a different subject matter in another language which you're not very familiar with, how would you how would you deal with it? And this is crucial for your future profession. Sometimes as a diplomat, you will be they will require you to answer questions or negotiate in areas which you have no idea what you're talking about, an area which you're not an expert in, and where you have to see the information that's put forth in front of you, and you need to digest it, analyze it, and and uh, and um, and 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 oops, sorry, here I have some problems here with the computer, and use it the best way possible in order to accomplish your job, which might be a negotiation, might be negotiating a treaty, a trade deal, or something else. So it's very important that you know how to deal fast um, with information that you never saw before, and how you digest it and analyze it quickly in a way uh, that is usable to the foreign ministry. That's why I think also as well they have these time constraints in the exam, and they put a lot of texts. This year they reduced it a little bit, because before, as you know, we had 13 questions, and now this year we have only 9 questions. But even so, it's still an extensive exam, and by being extensive and with a limited amount of time, they're testing exactly the your maturity and the way you deal with these unknowns, and how you are able to function as well. So this is one thing you always have to keep in mind. It's not just an English examination, it's a job interview. They're interviewing you and seeing if you have the proper skills to become a diplomat as well. Okay? So here I think, well, most of you already have read this text, and you already have finished this exercise. We're just basically going to correct it today. And here, this first text, as I was telling you before, is from Professor Chi Lu, a linguistics professor. And this is a very academic text. Oh, academic article. For you to have an idea, I researched where they found this article. It was at a database service for universities and colleges around the world, which is called JSTOR. Some of you might know it already, might recognize it. And this is where scholars usually go to read the newest articles in their field of studies. So this article was written for professors and was written for the linguistics community. And here you will have to decipher basically this text and answer it in a true or false fashion, which can be even more complicated to condense all of this knowledge into true or false questions. Sometimes very hard, even for the examiner. That's why sometimes there are a few ambiguous questions which might be wrong or right, you don't know, and always gives room for a recourse or recurso afterwards. So that's why I rarely see somebody who will get full marks, 100% in this first phase exam. Given all the pressure, the time constraints, the level of complexity of the questions, it's nearly impossible. I wouldn't say it's impossible. I think somebody might have already gotten I never got full marks in this first phase exam, but somebody might have come close to it. So always keep in mind that these time constraints and the situation that you do the exam in will hamper a lot your ability to do the questions. So that's why training is paramount. You always have to train. So it becomes almost automatic when you get there to the actual exam date. Okay. So starting here with text number 1, as I was talking to you about, Mr. Chun-Li from JSTOR. Mr. Chi Lu Chun-Li is from the video game. His text mainly, I'm not gonna read it out loud because you guys already read it. His text talks about, as I was saying, how American English and British English developed in relation to each other. And here he goes to some twists and turns in his arguments, which the examining board tried to exploit in order to confuse you a little bit. And this is something that they do a lot in reading comprehension texts. They try to confuse you by, one, changing the name of the person who was speaking. So they would, for instance, say that this statement belonged to that person when it was actually another person. Usually that they do that a lot. They also like to change, like to make comparisons in the text which are not really there. They like to make inferences which extrapolate anything that is said in the text. And sometimes they make superlative and categorical affirmations, which also are not present in the text, but they seem right. They seem like they make sense. And that's the big problem, because if you read it really quickly, they seem to make sense in the text as a whole. But then upon closer viewing, you see, oh, no. This is too extreme. This is not really said there. It's not even implied. So they were trying to trick you in putting a right when it's actually wrong, because the text doesn't go as far as to affirm what they were affirming. And here in this first exercise, you can see some examples of that. So now let's start actually our correction exam or correction class with here question 1. And question 1, let's read it out loud here. According to the text, the fact that social origin was not as easy to identify based on the coin of 18th century Americans, as was the case with contemporary Britons, reflected the early American colonies' egalitarian ethos. So what are your opinions on this one? This one, they try to confuse you again by equating the fact that as it says in the text, in the here, as it says here in the beginning of the text, as being a mark of social equality in the United States, when actually it doesn't even say that in the text. It says nowhere in the text does it even mention about the class system in the United States at that time. What it does say is says that the language in the United States, the dialect in the United States at that time, was almost the same across the board in every social status. It was very similar among the social classes in the United States, the dialect that they spoke, which was different from Great Britain. In Great Britain, no. In Great Britain, each social class had a different type of dialect, which really marked which social class they were in. For instance, you have today you have the Queen's English, which is usually spoken by the higher elites, the schooled elites, the more intellectual side of the British society. And you have Cockney accents, which is a more lower class accent. And by the way you speak, you can determine your class. In the United States, no. In the United States, the dialect was more bland at the time, at the 18th century. Everybody spoke pretty much the same dialect, regardless of your social status. If you were a wealthy landowner from Virginia or a poor white farmer, small farmer from New England, you would speak pretty much the same dialect. So the dialect that you spoke could not differentiate you from the other classes, which in Great Britain it could. But that does not mean that there weren't any different classes in the United States. There were very distinct classes in the United States, as well as any other, especially in the South, where you had a slavery system as well, which made things even worse, even more. So this is incorrect. They were trying to confuse you. You cannot assert that from the text. It does not mention that the United States did not have separate classes. All right. So the egalitarian ethos here could not be asserted from the text. And this brings me to another point, which is interesting here, I find, is that sometimes your knowledge in history that you study a lot for the exam might actually help you with reading comprehension in English. For instance, here, you would know from studying the Enlightenment and the American society around the Revolutionary War that there was great emphasis in political equality, not social equality, not social economic equality in the United States. That was never touched upon. So just from knowing that fact, you would know social origin, egalitarian ethos do not mix with the American society in the late 18th century, early 19th century. So right then and there, it's a historical inaccuracy. So right then and there, you could just eliminate this question. It's wrong. And of course, you always have to read the text. Always read. That's the first thing that you do. But here, just based on your historical knowledge, you could immediately see, oh, there's something wrong with this question. You have 90% chance. Then you would confirm it reading the text, just from reading this, just from your historical background. So this is what I mean when they also test your cultural background and also your basic general knowledge in other subjects as well, even in the English exam. Okay, and all right, so let's go move right along here to number 2. All right, it can be said from the text that to Britain's ears, to the British ears, contemporary American accents belie declining grammar standards in America as compared to colonial times. Here, I think one of the points that some candidates some students might be confused, is I think they use the word belie, that some of you might not know the meaning of it. And the actual definition of the word belie is somewhere around the area of it gives something it fails to give a true notion, a true impression of something. So it's like it contradicts one of the information that it contradicts an information that it contradicts something that was said before. So belie has this idea of contradiction, of something that negates something. So in this case, if you read it like that, you can read it as, it can be said that from the text that to British ears, contemporary American accents belie declining grammar standards in America as compared to colonial times. So it negates declining grammar standards in America as compared to colonial times. So that to British ears, contemporary American accent negates declining grammar standards. I think here is they try to confuse you with the first sentence here when they say, when did Americans start sounding funny to English ears? The story is not remarkable as it sounds. Okay. Here they oops. Just 1 second here. Okay, back again. Sorry for the interruption. Basically, number 2, they are creating a causal relationship which does not exist in the text. Here they're associating the declining grammar standards in the United States today, which is not mentioned here, with the way that Americans speak now, and that the British associate the contemporary American accent to a lower grammar standard, which is not the case. It does not say there. What they do say, what the author says, is that the American accent is judged today as being sort of inferior, and that is implied in the text, but never actually said. But it says you can infer that it's not as seen with somewhat disapproval from the British today, because back in the colonial days, they approved American English, the American accent, which is not the case today. But that does not mean that the grammar standards declined because of the accent. That's something which is not mentioned in the text. So this one is clearly wrong. Okay. In number 3, the author criticizes Krapp's argument that exemplars of transplanted languages or dialects, such as Akkadian French, are more archaic than the original ones, which continued evolving in their home countries. Okay, here basically again, he's negating one of the sides of the argument of Shri. Basically, what the author says is that dialects continue evolving in both places, and they always have evolved in the colonies and also in Great Britain. They just, as he says here at the end of the text, here, no single dialect is really transplanted, intact, and unchanging. American English is not 18th century British English frozen in time, while British English varies, changes in a different direction. Okay, so not only does British English change, as well as American English changes. So that idea that some linguists had before, that American English is an old form of British English which evolved, and the American English stayed intact and stayed true to its roots. It's not the case. Both of them are evolving. as well. So from that point, you can already see that that this affirmation is wrong, and also that that some transplanted languages or dialects, such as Akkadian French, are more archaic than the original French. That wouldn't even make sense chronologically. How would a colonial form of the language be older than the language spoken in the home country of the colonizers of the language? Even chronologically, that is wrong. So that doesn't have any logical sense in it. It has a flawed inner logic in that affirmation. From then on, you can see clearly that is also wrong, this affirmation. Okay? Number 4, the last one in question 1. The author asserts that the early dialect of colonial American was not influenced and shaped by a large wave of many migrants from many origins. The author asserts that early dialect was not influenced and shaped by the large waves of immigrants from many origins. This one is correct, and you can go directly to the text here and see that the founding generations of settlers wasn't immediately followed by a huge influx of immigrants with other dialects and languages until an American coin was already mostly established by newer generations of Americans, at which point recent immigrant waves began to adopt prevailing ways of speaking. So basically here, he is correct. The author says that early dialects of American was not influenced and shaped by a large wave of immigrants from many origins, because the large wave of immigrants from many origins came afterwards, after a few generations of colonial Americans were here already and had established American coin, which makes this assertion correct. Okay, this one was pretty clear-cut. It was a lot easier. We'll just go to the text. In some affirmations, assertions such as this one, you can easily go to the text and find the answer to most of them. You can. Some of them are more abstract. Some of them require you to have a actual background knowledge in the subject. It would be more helpful if you did have that subject, and it's not directly in the text. And some are inferences which you have to make as well. But they clearly, so that's why this is my number 2 tip for you. Always read what they're asking. Read very carefully what they're asking. And be careful with the words such as infers, the author says, it can be inferred, can be replaced, cannot be replaced, because this might change the whole validity of the assertion. So always be careful by these keywords. Okay. Now let's go to question number 2. Number 2 is not focused more on reading comprehension. It focuses on the second form of questions that they have in the exam, which is a vocabulary question. Unfortunately, these are very difficult to study because, well, you can't memorize the whole dictionary, and there's always new words and new things. It's very difficult to memorize the dictionary. These are this vocab examination will test your cumulative knowledge of English. It's something that you only get through reading, through exercising, doing other exams, and it's something which you cannot study. You cannot cram before the exam, right before the exam. Unfortunately, sometimes in these cases, these are the only questions that I would, in my case, leave blank in the exam, because as you know, in the CACD, every wrong question will eliminate one of your right question, one of your questions that you got right, will eliminate 1 point that you got right. So in this case, it's safer, play it safe. It's nearly impossible to guess what the word means by context, and they make sure of that. that you cannot guess directly the word by the context. Sometimes you can, but most of the time, no. So if you never saw that word in your life before, leave it blank. This is just sure thing. Leave it blank. Just leave it blank. Okay. So in this case, let's go to question number 2. Right. And in text 1, without altering the general meaning of the sentence, pinpoint could be replaced by, let's go, 1, ascertain. Can pinpoint be replaced by ascertain? Pinpoint. Pinpoint. And it's correct. You can change. If you go look at the definition of ascertain, ascertain is when you make sure of something. When you ascertain is you make sure you can determine something. And when you pinpoint, it's just, it comes from actually the definition, comes actually from the action to pin something. When you pin something, like on a map, when you pinpoint it, you determine its exact location. So it has the same meaning as ascertain. When you ascertain someone's address, for instance, someone's location, you have pinpointed their position. This is usually used in navigation for pilots, airline pilots, and if they pinpoint the location of the airport that they're going to, they have to ascertain the location of where they're going to. So they do have, yes, they could be easily replaced, and it would not affect the meaning of the sentence. Okay, so this one is correct. Which also, I already said it, makes number 2 correct. To ascertain is to determine something, to determine its exact location, to pinpoint its exact location. So pinpoint has the same meaning as ascertain and determine, which does not have the same meaning as compare. Compare, well, you know what compare means. Compare is not to determine. When you compare, you have 2 things. When you determine, you're determining one thing. You determine what that thing is specifically. You're not comparing it with other things. So this one is pretty clear-cut. It's wrong. Okay. All right. And now the last one, so what we have is convey. And to convey something is not to pinpoint something. To convey something is to pass the image of something, to give the impression of something when you convey something. And that is not the same meaning as to determine something. So I want to convey a positive image of Brazil. As a diplomat, I want to convey a positive image of Brazil to foreign investors. That is not the same thing to determine a positive determine a positive view of Brazil to foreign investors. Is not the same thing. It's a mental difference. This one was pretty easy, this exercise. So I think most of you already been at this game for at least a couple of years, I guess. So this, I think, wouldn't create too many problems. All right. And continuing with the tradition, here they ask us to consider the grammatical and semantic aspects of test 1. So they're not only testing your vocabulary, what the word means, but how that word is used in the context that they give you, and if it can be correctly employed in that context. So that gives you, I like this exercise in particular, this question from this year's from 2017's exam, because it gives you a overview of what they require of you. They require of you reading comprehension skills, vocabulary skills, and also a mix of both in the case of number 3, which is how do you effectively use that vocabulary in the text. Okay, so let's go to number 1. The word assimilated could be correctly replaced by blended without altering the meaning of the passage. Okay. In this case, yes, you can use the word assimilated in the sense of blended. because here the text is talking about is how different cultures, how new waves of immigrants and uh, assimilated or blended their own dialects and language to the colonial English, the American English present, which already existed from the earlier generations of Americans. So it has this idea of blending, of mixing in. In this case, assimilated has that idea. I think this might have caused a doubt in some candidates because it has that idea of absorbing as well, one culture absorbing another. But assimilated can also be to take in information or ideas and not necessarily be overwhelmed by that other culture. Not necessarily your culture needs to cease to exist in order to take in this new information. So like Italian immigrants, when they went to the United States, they assimilated into American culture, but that did not mean that their Italian culture was completely wiped out. They still have remnants of their Italian culture. To this day, you'll see there's still use a few Italian Americans still in some places still use some forms of Italian dialect still in their speech, and they mix it in with the American English to make it their own. But that doesn't mean that they didn't assimilate to the American culture. Okay. Number two, the adjective compelling could be replaced by thorough in this particular context. And no, just looking at the meanings of the words, I don't even have to go back to the text, and you see that this is not the case. Compelling does not mean thorough. Compelling means something is attractive. It means that something draws you in. People are inclined to follow that speech pattern, to follow the dialect. They're compelled to follow that speech dialect. It's not the same thing as being thorough. When you're being thorough, is that you check every little detail. You like, for instance, when you're finishing up your dissertation, you're very thorough. You read through it and see every mistake, correct every mistake, see if everything is right, if everything's formatted correctly. You're very thorough. You go through it very in depth, which is not the same thing as compelling. It's a completely different word here. Okay. 3. There we go. 3. The expression hold their tongue with could be replaced by uphold their dialect against, hold their dialect against without altering the meaning of the sentence. Okay. Here, let's go back here to, okay, so hold their tongue actually means the opposite of uphold. Actually, hold their tongue with means to be silent, to not say something that would upset somebody else. So that would be the opposite of upholding their dialect. Upholding would mean they promote it, they make sure, they protect it. And it would not have the same meaning if you would change hold your tongue with uphold. Okay, it would be actually almost the opposite meaning. All right, so this one, number 3, is incorrect. Easily incorrect. Okay, number 4. The expression a bunch of could be replaced by a cluster of without altering the meaning of the passage. And this one is correct. A bunch of does have that idea of a group, of a bunching, of a conglomerate, of when you put many things together, which is also the idea of a cluster. When you have a cluster, you have a very tight grouping of something. Like it could be a cluster of people, group of people. So that could have the meaning of a bunch of people. Also, a bunch of could also have a different meaning as well. Not a different, but a similar meaning, which is a bunch of could be used in the sense of there were a bunch of people over there. Also referring to there were many people over there. There was a large number of people over there. That could be used in that sense as well. So that might cause a little bit of a confusion with some candidates, but hopefully not. But in this case, if you look at the text, a bunch of could be replaced by a cluster, because he was referring to a group of people, a group. So in this case, they are nearly interchangeable. All right, so this one is correct. Okay, now we move on to the second text. This text was not part of any exam. I actually compiled this exercise. This exercise was based on a feeling that I have and something I've observed in the past 2-3 years of the exam, in which they, even in the first and now the second phase, the written exam, they are using a lot of texts which deal with the diplomatic career itself and the diplomatic language and how diplomats act. Oh, here we go. Exercise 2, how they act and how they behave in their profession. So I picked this text up from the Margaret Thatcher Foundation. There's no ideological indoctrination here intended in this exercise. This was just a text about this particular diplomat and how he parted ways with tradition and wrote a valedictory dispatch, which, if some of you might remember, was a expression that was used in the written exam in 2015, which caught some people off guard because, first of all, they didn't know what dispatch meant and they didn't know what valedictory meant. And in this case, valedictory dispatch would be his last report, his farewell report, which is almost like a letter to his post and to his colleagues, where he expressed all the his gratitudes for being at that post and for leaving, and he tries to go over in retrospect all of his accomplishments and at that post. And in turn, he sometimes, most of the time, as in the text, he just receives pleasantries from his colleagues, and it's a very traditional way to leave your post. In this particular case, he used his valedictory dispatch to provide his colleagues with an analysis of what he saw as the British decline in the late 1970s. Its decline in the world and its decline internally, just basically all in the state of affairs. All of its state of affairs were pretty bad, in his opinion, at the time. All right. So I tried to play with this vocabulary that some of you might not know, which is more specific to the diplomatic career itself, and something that you will learn when you join the diplomatic corps. So it was interesting to do an exercise based on language like this. Okay, so very quickly, because we are quickly running out of time, I followed the same pattern as I'm seeing in the other exams, which is reading comprehension questions together, coupled with vocabulary and analytical questions as well. Okay, always based on the text. Okay. Question number 4. Considering the ideas expressed in text number 2, decide whether the following items are right or wrong. Okay. Number 1. According to the text, valedictory dispatches are often perfunctory diplomatic communiques, which gives a bird's eye view of an ambassador's accomplishments in a given post. Okay, and this one I tried to play as well with to try to test your vocabulary. So I was killing two birds with one stone. So I use words like perfunctory. Diplomatic communiques are easily understood in a bird's eye view, which is a nice expression to use. A bird's eye view meaning that you have an overview of everything. It gives you an overview. Think of a bird flying over a city. He has a view of everything that's happening in the city, a bird's eye view, a holistic view of what's happening. So here I tried to play with, as they do sometimes in the exam, I tried to say the same exact thing but with different expressions to see if you guys would still understand it. Okay. All right. So in this one is incorrect. The first one is incorrect because I also made some extrapolations from what they were saying there, or from what the text was saying, which it did not say. It seems right if you know what the words mean. Perfunctory means something superficial. Means that these communiques, these valedictory dispatches, are usually superficial, which you can sort of infer from what they're saying here. But it's not textually said there. It's something that you would have to extrapolate to understand, because here he clearly says that the colleagues admire the depth of that person's insights. So that would not necessarily make it superficial. Of course, it might be not long and extensive, but maybe the ideas contained in these valedictory dispatches are actually quite deep. Of course, you won't be able to develop it further. It's not a dissertation or a PhD thesis, but some of the subject matter might be quite deep. So not necessarily are they perfunctory or superficial, which is what perfunctory means. So in this case, in this sense, that was the main mistake here in this first item. The other ones you pretty much could say are correct. Usually they try to just basically list their accomplishments in their valedictory dispatches. Okay. Number 2, Ambassador Henderson's document differed from other post-farewell letters. Here I tried to change it up a little bit to see if you knew what valedictory dispatches mean. For it offered an honest assessment of his home country's current slump rather than a mere personal retrospective. Here, instead of decline, I used slump as well to test, again, your vocabulary. They always do this in reading comprehension questions. They also test your vocabulary at the same time. So here, in this case, the assertion is correct. You can gather that from the text. The main difference from his valedictory dispatches to traditional ones is that instead of going on about his own accomplishments, about his time at his post, he went on to make a diagnosis of Great Britain in the late 1970s, which is something that usually ambassadors, career diplomats usually do not do. That's something reserved for pundits and for academics usually. So that's why later on he says that he might be going well beyond his responsibilities as an ambassador for that reason. Okay. Number 3, it can be inferred. Focus on the word inferred. So it's not going to be there directly. It can be inferred that the use of the expression horribly frank that the author of the text found. It can be inferred that the use of the expression horribly frank that the author of the text. I think we have some here, a typo, I would say. It can be inferred from the author of the text that Ambassador Henderson's, that the author of the text, I was correct. I'm going to edit this out. Of the text found Ambassador Henderson's account to be in poor taste. And here, of course, I was trying to confuse you with the use of the word horribly, because if you look at the definition of the word horribly is usually something bad. And in this case, especially in Great Britain, they use sometimes the expression horribly or terribly, not in their original meaning, but to mean almost the same as the word very. So here he's amplifying the meaning of the word frank. So here, actually what he intends to say is a very frank or a very honest take on things, a very honest expose of Great Britain in the late 1970s, of its state of affairs. So actually, it means the opposite. It wasn't in poor taste. He doesn't even mention that. Of course, the author of the text might think that, but it's not said in the text. He's actually commending him for it. He admires, as you can see later on, he admires the bravery when he uses the word unflinching analysis, meaning a courageous analysis. So this leads me to think that the author admires his diagnosis, his analysis, right? So it's the opposite of what this assertion says. Okay, so this one again was trying to confuse you with the vocabulary. Something that if you look at glance it quickly, you might not even notice. Oh, horrible is bad, and you're right, wrong. But it's actually, and you're right, and it's actually correct. Okay, so it can be concluded, again, another inference from the text, that it was difficult for Ambassador Henderson to pen his report, since his words went beyond the limits of an ambassador's responsibilities. So here we're confused two seemingly unrelated topics, which is here, first of all, it does not mention that it was hard for him to write. It mentions that the situation was hard, that the situation that he saw in Great Britain, the state of affairs, was a painful situation for his country. It was not that it was painful for him to write his valedictory dispatch. And he also wasn't too concerned that his words went beyond the ambassador's responsibilities. He was actually quite proud of that, as if you read the final paragraph. He is proud and not at all concerned about going past the limits of his responsibilities. Okay. And number 3 was, again, now more vocabulary focused, now more directly vocabulary focused, and seeing if you could use the vocabulary in the context of the text. Okay? So here, number 1. Unflinching, the word unflinching could be correctly replaced by steadfast without changing the meaning of the text. And this is correct. This one you have to know what the meaning of the word steadfast was. If you didn't, leave it blank. Steadfast also means unflinching, which means can mean courageous, somebody who gives a fearless account of something. Okay, so something where there's no holds barred, or something where he says exactly what he intends to say. He's direct, which is the case of this ambassador. Okay. Number 2, again, more vocab. The word seminal could also mean original. Yes, it could. The word seminal comes from even the same root as the word seed, which means origin, which means something germinated from something. It can also mean, in other cases, something crucial, something very important to something else. So this seminal document might be one first of its kind, a valedictory dispatch written in this form, and it's also a very crucial and important document, so the author says of this text, which for diplomatic discourse and diplomatic language, because he tinkered with tradition here and changed it a little bit in an interesting way. So it's 2 things. It's set in motion a new way of thinking in diplomacy, and also it's That's why it's also a crucial document to be read by later, future generations. Okay, so it could mean, look at the word could, and not only, it could mean original. Okay, so one of the definitions is original. Okay, maybe just pay really close attention to the words like could, should. If it said it's the only meaning, no, then it's incorrect. It has other meanings like crucial, important, but it also has this meaning of original, has meaning of origin as well. Okay. And this one is to this assertion was created in order to test your attention span, because this is already at the end of our exercise, and I wanted to see if you were paying attention. This happened last year and the year before as well. You're so used to doing exercises where this word could be replaced with another word, so you automatically go, oh, yes or no. This one I changed it up a little bit and I said this could not be replaced. So we have to really pay attention to the word not there, because it's the opposite actually. The adjective measured could not be replaced by careful in this particular context. And now it's incorrect because of the negative there, the could not. It can be replaced. So you have to really pay attention to these words. And measured in the context that he's using here is that he was very careful with his words. Even though he was not following tradition, he was still a diplomat, and he was still measuring his words. He was very careful with what words he was using. Okay, because he could offend somebody, he could say things he wasn't allowed to say, so he was very measured. It was very deliberate, it was planned out. Okay, it wasn't something he did out of a whim. Okay. And last but not least, the word couched is synonymous with uttered. Okay. And it's correct. The word couched, if you look at a dictionary, one of the possibilities is to utter. Couch means when you, or when you frame an argument, something, it's framed in that sense, or it was uttered that way, it was spoken that way. So here, if you go back to the text, here. Here you could see that by tradition, such documents offered a tour d'horizon, which is a French expression, sometimes especially in diplomatic circles. In English, you use the French expression, like French chargé d'affaires, attaché. You always use the French expressions, which is sometimes hard to translate into Portuguese, because you also have to know some French words in order to translate some English expressions. Which is not difficult for any of us, because we also have to know French for the exam, and pretty high level of French at that. And so here, tour d'horizon of the ambassador's time in the post, couched in a more personal style than ordinary diplomatic traffic. So here, basically what they're saying here is uttered in a more personal style, or what we said in a more personal style. Okay, so here, in this sense, it could be, we could replace it by the word utter, which is to say something, okay, in a more personal style, because most diplomatic communiques are usually very bureaucratic. The language is very bureaucratic. In this case, is a more personal recount of what the ambassador went through at his post. Okay, and with this, we conclude our first exercise class. We just scratched the surface of the exam. Next classes, I will bring different style of questions and different style of texts, focus more on IR economics texts from publications such as The Economist, The Guardian, and other news outlets such as that, and also some art history texts. And we'll see how you will fare in these exercises. Okay, so thank you very much. And I'll see you next time with more exercises. Thank you very much.